One of the biggest and most important issues that I've not yet covered much on this channel is the concept of data sovereignty, which in simple terms just means the data that you own, you control. It seems obvious, right? Because your data is your intellectual property. These are the ideas and the understanding which makes you and your business unique and special. Yet for some reason, the principles which we think of as normal don't seem to apply to the technology world. And now with AI, it's going to get a whole lot worse. And to me, this is a compelling reason why we should be developing local sovereign AI so we can keep our intellectual property away from prying eyes. So in this video, I'd like to talk about the Cloud Act and explain why I feel this is such a dangerous overreach and a basic breach of trust. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a story about Japanese whiskey. I'm a big fan of whiskey, particularly Speyside Scotch, but I'm also a big fan of Australian whiskies such as Lark and Starward. But Japanese whiskies are something else. Scottish and Australian whiskies can often feel rugged and rough, but Japanese whiskey is restrained, balanced, and intentional. Japan has a really interesting whiskey culture, and there are whiskey bars where customers will buy a full bottle of whiskey, write their name on the tag or label, and the bar stores it for them on a shelf. The whole system works on trust. You're not there to monitor the bottles, some of which can cost hundreds of dollars, but you trust the bar owner to protect your bottle and not sell your whiskey to others. The system is known as Botoru Kipu, which is an anglicised version of bottle keep. So on future visits, the patrons drink from their own bottle and typically just pay for mixers and a small service charge. Bottles are usually kept for a set period, and it's a way to make repeat visits feel personal and lower the per drink cost for regulars. And it's also a great sign that you belong to a particular establishment. I think it's a wonderful system and a great way for business owners to maintain intimacy and trust with their customers. So why am I telling you all this? Because that's how I believe we should be thinking about our data. Instead of whiskey being stored at the bar, now think of your data being stored in a data center. There, we also have a relationship of trust where you are entrusting a service provider to keep your data safe and make a reasonable margin for giving you that data whenever you need. But the problem is the Cloud Act, which now makes that very difficult. American legislators seem to love their acronyms, and the Cloud Act means the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act. It sounds like something that a librarian came up with, but what it says is actually quite terrifying. If you store your data in a US headquartered technology company, the US government can compel disclosure of that data. Not just data stored in America, but any data stored anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if it's in Sydney or Frankfurt or Tokyo, it doesn't matter. If Microsoft, Google, Amazon, or OpenAI holds it, the US Department of Justice could reach out across the ocean and just take it. And the worst part is they don't have to tell you. They don't need to tell your customers. And that's because there's a provision called non-disclosure, that orders legal gags against the provider from even letting you know that a request was made. So in other words, they're allowed to go to your bottle of whiskey, take a glass and enjoy it, and never even need to tell you about it. And that's a huge breach of trust. There's something about that which just feels incredibly wrong. And if you think about that from a business perspective, it means your financials, your contracts, your pricing, employer records, even board papers sitting in SharePoint, all of it is a subpoena away from being read by a foreign government, and you may never even find out. But it gets worse because it's not just about espionage or terrorism cases. The Cloud Act can be invoked for any serious crime under US law. That includes economic offences, tax matters, antitrust investigations, sanctions. The scope is really broad. And here in Australia, we're not totally safe either because there are additional protections in place. And as a close ally to the US, we signed a bilateral Cloud Act agreement with the US in December 2021. Our data is in the pipe, but to activate that, the US would need to use routes through the Australian authorities, which still thankfully has some review and oversight. So now this is where AI can actually make things a lot worse, because every time you paste a document into ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, or Claude, that content leaves your network and it probably travels to a US cloud or somebody working on a US hyperscaler. It gets processed, logged, and in many cases, retrained for model improvement, abuse monitoring, or even legal review. People in your business are doing this right now, I guarantee it. They're copy-pasting board commentary, pricing, decks, presentations, customer lists, you name it, into web interfaces run by American companies. And how this works in practice with the Cloud Act is not entirely clear. And while it may be totally innocuous, that's really not the point. It's a massive breach of trust, and there should be far more protections and controls in place. This is a key principle behind what I'm building with Kiraa. The solution we're building is designed to run locally on Apple's powerful silicon architecture, on-premise, in your office, in a building under your control. We use a technology called cache augmented generation, which means in practice that your corporate context sits locally and the model answers deterministically from that local context. We've built the core analytical engine, and we've now started migrating the remaining cloud services onto local devices. There's still a lot of work to do, but the idea is that eventually we'll have a solution which protects your data sovereignty. Now, that doesn't mean we're supporting things that are illegal. The government still has a right and indeed an obligation to make sure that everything is above board, and I have absolutely no issue with that. But I do have an issue with data being taken without due process and notification. This is a fundamental principle of trust, and no Japanese whisky lover would ever trust a bar owner who regularly helped themselves to your scotch. Sovereignty is not a marketing word. It's a core fundamental principle which citizens have been upholding and protecting for centuries. The Cloud Act feels like a massive overreach and a violation of trust. And at the end of the day, business only works where there's trust. Now, I'm sure there are people out there who can make very strong counter arguments about national security, and those are all perfectly valid. But those decisions should be made in public with oversight, not behind closed doors. If you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing to my channel. I've recently opened up memberships for those who'd like to support what we do. Thank you again for watching, commenting, and sharing your perspectives, and I'll see you in the next one.